amazing talk, Christoph. I enjoyed it a lot. Let me start by saying that. Let me also comment on two things, because I have 30 minutes. I was still saying that. And it was really this type of presentation that triggers a lot of follow-up questions. And you were saying this thing about Milei and Trump, and I think that the way I see it is more of a sort of a strategic state-business alliance for planning. So more and more, I think we need, it's not like either or, but how these different powerful actors that are driving global capitalism today coordinate, and to what extent they can establish coalitions, and what are the internal clashes of power of those coalitions, up to where they can combine their objectives or not. And then, just because it was there on the slide, when I use the term sphere of control, I not only refer to the planning of innovation, but broadly is the term, I would define it as the unit of corporate planning, basically. And it's my way of putting a term to all the different networks that leading corporations, particularly intellectual monopolies, control beyond ownership. So it includes the corporate innovation system, but it also includes global value chains, global production networks, and the way you want to call them, the franchisees, if they have franchisees, platform complementers, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of precisely because what the common denominator is this capacity to control beyond ownership, doing it by means of planning, of expanding corporate planning beyond the market where the company directly operates, and also beyond the internal operation of the company, is that I use the term sphere of control, and also because I connected, and this is when I start moving towards my presentation, because I also connected to control technologies. So for planning, it's indispensable to be able to process information, and the more complex the planning process becomes, the more outsourced, quote-unquote, the process becomes, so the larger the sphere of control beyond the company itself, more the company requires control technologies, today we would say digital technologies, for planning the sphere. And so it's not only that it requires data, but it also requires the means to make sense of all that data. And this is why discussing about planning innovation is not only a subtopic within the discussions about corporate planning or planning more broadly, but I think that it's directly connected to the larger discussion about planning and who plans whom and how. But let me start because, well, perhaps not in this group, but when I speak of planning innovation, a lot of people think, hey, are you crazy? Okay, we take it. Companies plan production process when they are reproducing commodities. States plan when they are deciding some industrial policies and so on, but innovation is the outcome of serendipity. Innovation is just something that happens, and there is this, what I would describe as the myth of innovation myth, very much associated with Silicon Valley, but it has penetrated every industry, where you can name it in different ways. You can simply, if you go to a garage and start something, you can eventually be one of the top 100 companies in the NASDAQ, or you just need to move fast and break things, associated with Meta, which also speaks a lot about this idea of innovations coming by accident and just trial and error. You just keep on trying, and eventually something will stick. But then when you go and ask the people that are managing the R&D departments of these companies, they think completely the opposite. What they are doing is planning innovation. And there is this quote that I often use from one of the interviews that I did for my forthcoming book, which comes from a former IBM vice president of IBM Research in particular, where the guy was basically saying serendipity is something that is planned. Not at the dictating level of the particular item, but in the sense of putting great people in contact with great resources and identify needs and let them go. That is how you plan for serendipity and get results. So basically, what this guy was acknowledging is that it's true that planning innovation is not as simple as following a recipe to bake a cake. But at the same time, you need to do certain things. You need to organize and define in certain ways the production of new knowledge. And I will argue also that what planning innovation is about is not just about what this guy is saying, but it's also about steering the research questions, defining what is a research question and what is not, what are the relevant methods and what are not the relevant methods. Doing this in part with finance, but not only. So if we're going to speak about planning innovation, who's the planner? And this is where I will be somehow very synthetic and of course will push the argument a bit, because again, it has always been about businesses, large businesses, corporations, and states also planning innovation. But if we want to think in terms of the large technological paradigms, we can think that there was a time when the US state was the planner. In particular, what Linda Weiss defined as the US national security state, that many associate only with DARPA, but it was not just DARPA. And I think that even if, again going to these reinterpretations of authors that Christophe was doing, even if Weiss doesn't use the term planning, even if Fred Bloch doesn't use the term planning, even if Mariana Mazzucato doesn't use the term planning, they are all referring to the planning of science and technology. And this is why when one thinks of planning innovation, probably the first thing that comes to mind is during the Cold War, how the US government was directing and guiding, not only just simply putting money out there and leaving the companies do whatever they wanted to do, but really steering the internal developments of the companies with different strategies. But at the same time, this way of organizing and planning innovation took a sudden turn, if you want, that I call the demise of the US national security state, which is basically, this came in a clear order, but it's okay, which was the end of the Cold War. And we can think there that in terms of these broad paradigm shifts, there was a sort of decade of a sort of empty space for planning innovation, until big tech companies filled that space. And there is an increased reliance on AI and digital technologies in the military sector, and one could interpret that process as a sort of revival of the DARPA moment. But there are at least two huge differences. And this directly refers to who is planning. The first thing is that for a company like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, the military sector is only one more vertical. It's not the core of their business, and then they start also operating in some other place. These are not military providers at all. They have dozens, even we could argue hundreds of different industries that they are supplying technology. And therefore, it means that when, of course, this doesn't mean that having a contract with the military sector doesn't matter, but it means that it will not matter as much for their, if you want, the objective of expanding profits. It does matter for the objective of expanding control, because having an alliance with a crucial part of the US government, for instance, or with the Israeli government for Project Nimbus, for instance, and we can continue naming examples, of course matters at the level of to what extent these companies can perpetuate in their position of power, to what extent these alliances enable them to influence regulation, and I'm going to go back to that later on. But this presentation is not so much about what happened to the US state, but more about how is it that, in particular, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google became the planners of the main technological paradigm of today, which is artificial intelligence. And I will argue that this is done in three combined ways. One is internal R&D. Of course, these companies are the largest investors in R&D in the world, more like at the corporate level, and compared to states, only the US government and the Chinese government spend more in R&D than any of them, so they are huge investors in R&D. And part of that is channeled to develop internal processes of knowledge or innovation production. And I will not focus on this, although I can, during the Q&A, I can comment a lot on the differences, in particular the difference between the Amazon's Grand Challenges division and how DeepMind operated and how it operates now since ChatGPT, and a lot of details about that. But to some extent, we can broadly think of these big R&D laboratories as similar to the Bell Labs or IBM Research in the past. But this is only one part of the story. And this is why this is not what for the Schumpeterian literature would be described as Schumpeter Mark II, the big corporation in charge of doing the R&D. Because a huge part of the knowledge that these companies appropriate, and this is one of the things that we say in the intellectual monopoly literature, is that a big part of the knowledge that they turn into intangible assets has been actually co-produced with thousands of other actors that are part of what now Joseph Bates in another room is defining as the periphery. to people from global value chains. I will make a footnote here that I wanted to say that earlier I presented also there, and I said the word corporate planning like 10 times, and they were not horrified. I think that, and I also mentioned planning and democratic planning at the Digital Economy Network. I think that this network will become more and more popular over the years, and it's becoming more and more relevant, at least for the other networks that I follow. End of the footnote. Just to congratulate the organizers. Okay, so I'm not going to focus on the internal part, precisely because I think that what's more relevant to understand the extent of this capacity to control beyond ownership in the process of planning AI can be more interestingly analyzed if we look at how these companies control the knowledge and innovation network in AI. And here I've been doing a lot of research that I'm not going to explain in detail today, because today I want to speak more about the more general trend in the ways they plan. But basically what I have shown is that already like several years before ChatGPT and so on, companies like in particular Google, Amazon and Microsoft were already focusing all their research on expanding their knowledge and their capacity to develop AI models. And one could say, okay, and this comes from the table on the top. That is a text mining analysis of the content of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google scientific publications between 2014 and 2019. One could say, okay, this was internal R&D, actually. They were internally doing all this R&D. But actually, when we go and look at not only each of these companies' respective networks of co-authors, but also look at the network that is pushing the frontier in AI, defined by the top 14 AI conferences in the world. So, and we look there at the organizations that are presenting their papers in these conferences, we see that from 2012 to 2020, a process where Amazon, in particular Microsoft and Google, but also Amazon and Meta, from either not being in the network, so not being part of the organizations that were presenting their research more often in the most important AI conferences, so arguably saying that they were not part of the frontier in AI, to occupy the central positions in the network. And this is what I'm highlighting with the squares there. Microsoft and Google, Alphabet in the central positions of the network. Which means, going back to something that I was anticipating before, that these companies not only appropriate knowledge that was co-developed or directly developed by other organizations, but also that they have the largest capacity to steer the development of the industry and the field itself. Because they are not only influencing the content of the research of their co-authors or the people from other organizations that they are funding, but also the co-authors of their co-authors and the co-authors of the co-authors of their co-authors, which is a sort of corollary of how networks operate. And I said that there were 3 ways in which they are planning AI, and I will now anticipate the third one, but will then go more in detail into the second one. The third one is planning and controlling regulations and crafting narratives. So it's not only about how they are shaping what computer scientists, let's say, are researching on AI, or what a startup company is doing in terms of developing a model or an application of AI, but also they shape the ways in which society at large thinks about what AI is, how it should be regulated, and how it shouldn't be regulated. So let me give you more empirics, that because I often focus on the research part, I sometimes leave less space to also discuss about how they control open source and why this is relevant for the discussion about planning innovation. Just give me 1 second to drink water to recover my voice. Okay, so it's very straightforward to say, when corporations contribute to open source, participate in open source communities, this is because they want to keep their employees happy. This is because of reputational impacts, and I'm not denying that. I'm not saying that this is not relevant. They can also, of course, and most companies do it, they can reuse part of the code that is in open source for their own proprietary software. They also get feedback in advance from what then will most likely be users of their technologies. And of course, from a more Marxist perspective, we can say that they also profit from developers' free work. And I've done some empirics on this, but going to the reasons why I think this is relevant for corporate planning, we need to focus on the final dimensions or motivations. And when a company like Meta, for instance, we have there Mark Zuckerberg explaining to shareholders why he decided that Meta's AI models, Llama, were going to stay what he defines as open source, but it's not exactly open source. We can then discuss that later on, but still. What he's clearly saying is that he wants to control other companies. And the way to do it is by putting a piece of software available so that others adopt it more, turn it into a norm of the industry, into a de facto standard. So the definition of the standards, being them legal standards or de facto standards, is a way to plan innovation. Those who end up having a say, a larger say, in the spaces where industrial standards are set, are planning innovation, are planning how the future development of the industry will be done or not. And this is why it's not only about Meta's Llama. For instance, Google put in open source TensorFlow, which is a machine learning library, and this resulted in everyone speaking the same language. It's like, oh, everybody speaks English. Cool for the Anglophones. It's like, yeah, well, it didn't happen by chance or coincidence. There is a history of imperialism and so on as well. Similar here. So this was put in, these pieces of software are put in open source, but at the same time, this doesn't mean that the company loses the control over the whole development of innovation. They have this precisely because they plan innovation. We can think of it as a sort of puzzle, where they decide what to do with each puzzle. So with which scholars they will be co-developing one piece of the puzzle, what are the startups that they are going to fund, and I will go to that in 1 second, to expand certain developments over others and steer what these companies are developing. They can also put pieces of their software in open source, and they can go to conferences and say what they are doing, because all this only makes sense when it all comes together, and the only ones that can see the whole picture are Amazon, Microsoft, Google in particular, as well as many other intellectual monopolies in their respective subfields. But I will go into 1 second, I will in 1 second say why Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are so different. How am I going with the time?
13 minutes.
Okay, so I will skip the part. No, I will say very briefly. I will. wait, I ended up skipping it. Okay, so I mentioned briefly the control over startups, and this is not exclusive for AI, and of course not exclusive for Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, who will be, from the next slide, kind of the focus of my presentation. And this, one of the ways in which this has been done, or one of the ways in which we can track this, going back to the discussions about how can we measure all this. We see that inside global value chains there is a process of corporate planning beyond ownership. How can we measure something that is different from what it looked like at first sight? So one way to do it is by, instead of only focusing on acquisitions, which end up being more ownership, looking at corporate venture capital and why they are doing it. Because corporate venture capital in the tech sector, in particular for US corporations, is not driven by an aim of profiting more. It's not a financial investment, even if then it can be as a sort of like secondary benefit from doing it, it can become a financial investment. It's a way of controlling what type of research those companies are doing, steer the research, and also is a way to very early on lock them into their technologies. So basically, and everybody knows the example of Microsoft with OpenAI, but this same story has been replicated with hundreds, even thousands of startups that end up becoming locked into the clouds of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. Because even sometimes the money doesn't come as a wire transfer, but it's just a sort of blank check for the cloud. So these companies will be forced to spend this investment inside that cloud, which means developing their whole software architecture on the cloud. And once that is done, it's not just, the cloud is not like a sort of blank page where you code and then you can copy everything and paste it somewhere else. Coding inside the cloud means calling through APIs a lot of other services. And those other services, as I will explain in 1 second, are black boxes. So the locked in is much more harder to overcome than in the case of control or monopolization of other types of technologies. And this is because the public cloud is much more than infrastructure as a service. It is infrastructure as a service, of course, but it's ultimately a supermarket for digital technologies. Every digital technology today is being offered on the cloud, and quite often it was also developed on the cloud. I often use the example of a cake. So if I want to bake a cake, I need to buy the ingredients. I buy them on the cloud. And then I prepare the cake on the cloud. And then I bake the cake on the cloud. And then someone will consume the cake if I'm selling the cake, also on the cloud. So from an economic perspective, the extent of control is not just the control of production up to the market or the market being transformed into planning. They are reuniting the whole economic process that in principle capitalism had separated. So we have production, exchange, distribution, and consumption in only one virtual space. And this virtual space, like every economy, is not just made of the services that are developed by Amazon, Microsoft, or Google. And this is why I'm showing you their AWS Marketplace. And just highlighting as an example that by April 2025, there were over 50,000 services offered on AWS. And most of this are being offered by so-called partners. These are other companies, not only startups. We also have IBM, SAP, Siemens, we can continue naming. So we have several companies and also other organizations offering services in a virtual space where all the rules, the norms, the protocols, how things should be done, even when and they will be able to increase prices, everything is set and defined, in this case, by AWS. So this is why when Satya Nadella, for instance, who is Microsoft CEO, says, as AI gets more efficient and accessible, we will see its use skyrocket, turning it into a commodity we just can't get enough on. What he is saying is, I wish this happens, because this means more consumption of the cloud, more organizations on the cloud, because there will be more organizations developing models, and eventually they will be developing them on the cloud. If they don't develop them on the cloud, they will eventually sell them on the cloud, like even Elon Musk's Grok models will be sold on Microsoft Azure, for instance. DeepSeek offers all its models on Amazon, Microsoft, and Google Cloud. So even if you develop your own models, Meta as well, with your data centers, eventually you need to go to the market where everything is sold. And the more AI uptake, the more these businesses will skyrocket. And they know that the uptake depends on having more companies producing AI models. So it's not that they want to become the ones that control the only AI models. They prefer more companies producing AI models because that's also a way in which companies like, let's say, OpenAI, to continue with the example, will not be aiming at developing an ecosystem that is independent from this one, because they will need to be more focused on outpacing the other potential AI models than thinking about diversification. So, what is the impact of all this in the economy? Because so far this could be a story of how in one very important sector, all the companies that are participating in it become ultimately planned by Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. But the thing is that these technologies are being adopted wide and large, in particular by the public sector and leading corporations. Because as I was saying in the beginning of my presentation, these are control technologies. So other leading corporations, other intellectual monopolies. If you're a big pharma company, you need to do drug development, or more accurately, you push other organizations to do the drug development that you will then encapsulate because you have the exclusive knowledge on how to go from bench to bed, but you will push them to do it using AI as a method for invention. If you're a big pharma company, you will also use AI for identifying who are the physicians that are prescribing your drugs more, to go and visit them more often instead of just visiting everyone regardless. You will also use AI to identify which are the more efficient clinics when you're doing clinical trials. So the use of AI is not just for the development of the drug, but comprehensively spread if you want throughout the value chain. And this is for the case of pharma, but I could have given the case of companies like BlackRock that operate a platform called Aladdin that sits on Microsoft's cloud, but that at the same time has as its main asset the data and the capacity to process data. And for all this, more and more, it's not only about its own AI developments, but also about the strategic agreements with Amazon, Microsoft, and or Google. And this can also lead us to speak about, if you want, the automobile industry, where companies, for instance, Renault has a strategic agreement with Google precisely to introduce Android to its cars, while at the same time for Google it was the opportunity to lock Renault into its cloud. And going beyond these examples, what we are witnessing is a process where in order to govern, in order to plan, organizations require information. This is the way in which states can control citizens and have controlled citizens in the past. The same goes for what companies do inside the factory with workers, and also in the process of controlling beyond ownership, how networks or other organizations are controlled. For all this, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft are offering control technologies as a black box, subordinating other powerful actors, but at the same time enabling them to plan better. And this is why, in the end, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft still rule by controlling the digital sphere and rule way beyond the tech sector. But finally, to conclude, let me move to how all this had its own chapter at the level of planning regulations. So these companies were not saying you shouldn't regulate AI. That's like a very dumb strategy. They are where they are because above all they have intelligence strategies. That's not what they are doing. What they are doing is shaping the type of regulation. And part of the focus was on saying you need to regulate the risky uses of AI. The problem is to use AI for pornography. The problem is to use AI for building a bomb, not how AI is produced and how the knowledge needed and the data needed for producing AI and the nature needed for producing AI is being extracted, appropriated, captured by a few companies only. And the way to make sure that this was going to work in a way that favored them was to blame China. But interestingly, China, my argument would be that Chinese big tech companies and Chinese startups do not want to beat the US. They just want to be fast imitators. And here you have some, I don't have a lot of time to go into this in detail, but here you have some snippets of other interviews with Chinese companies where they're clearly saying that their strategy, the best business strategy, the best strategy to plan their own spheres of control is to do fast imitation. And this even applies to DeepSeek. In this map that I didn't present in detail, but I talked about it, the clusters that are now highlighted are clusters mostly populated by Chinese organizations, also Microsoft, and some people have already heard me speak about what that means, but just in case you want, I can further also unpack that. These Chinese organizations, even if they were not at the forefront in terms of the number of papers that they were presenting in terms of the latest AI technology, already by that time, they were doing research on generative AI. So it's not that the Chinese didn't have the capabilities. And they could have launched a ChatGPT that was not as good, but they decided not to do it. And I say not as good because it's true that there was a limitation in terms of access to AI semiconductors. But there was no need in launching the best ChatGPT. They could have launched one. But they would have, my argument is that these companies prefer imitation because of geopolitical constraints. And they have disciplinary cases like Huawei, TikTok, that explain that you can have the latest technology or you can have updates in the technology, but still, that doesn't make your life easy in terms of leading the market. It's not that automatically you will have a larger business. And then there is also the fact that the geopolitical constraints operate in two ways. Because these companies are mostly operating inside China. So they mostly have data for China, their models make more sense internally for China, and they know they have a protected market inside China. So it's not that their market will be conquered by other companies and therefore they need to outpace these other companies. So I think that this is another reason why, a key reason why this threat from China is part of the narrative crafted by big tech. Because arguably these companies do not want to outpace the US cloud giants. And what ends up happening is that it favors these companies because the existence of China ends up generating, again, more AI uptake, also more competition for AI startups, and it's a regulatory shield. And it's a regulatory shield because then, and I'm going to speak about Biden because of course, I mean, with Trump, directly this it's like, it's easier to see this, but already with Biden administration, what they did was basically what the companies wanted in terms of regulating AI. So just to conclude, because I don't have time to explain this now, some of information and knowledge appropriation to explain these dynamics of means and how there are specific means for doing corporate planning, and data centers, undersea cables are part of that. And then it's also about planning narratives, crafting narratives that then make people think, for instance, that regulation stifles innovation, that China is a threat, and so on and so forth. But what we have at the same time, when we have this form of planning innovation, and this is the last thing that I will say, are two complementary dynamics. One is what can be described as intangibles extractivism, which can also be, which can be briefly defined as science and technology that is produced from the peripheries. The peripheries meaning not only geographical peripheries, but all the organizations that are part of the peripheries of the spheres of control, that are monetized by a few giants from the core. But also, what in my forthcoming book I define as epistemic totalitarianism. So imposing topics, methods, and ultimately a way of thinking about all this. And if I have 10 seconds, I would say that intangibles extractivism, and in particular in the case of digital, one of the things that it has triggered is what can be defined as twin extractivism. Because it reinforces the extraction of nature. It only takes 1 second to connect data centers with electricity use, water use, and so on. Thank you.